Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Lunch and Learn. My name is Kyla Hannington, and I'm the Public Outreach and Engagement Division Chief with the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights, the county's civil and human rights education and enforcement agency. With me today as co-hosts are Tiana Davis, the Outreach Specialist with the Office of Human Rights, and Dr. Audrey Lau, the Adult and Senior Services Specialist with the Prince George's County Memorial Library System, our event partners for the whole Lunch and Learn series and for many other programming initiatives. We've been holding Lunch and Learns together now for nearly 1 year, and it is our honor to have been joined by some of the most amazing, interesting people, from NASA astronauts and scientists to civil rights leaders to judges to poets and more. And we're so lucky, honestly, we're so lucky to get to do this. And today to be welcoming two more fascinating guests, Dr. Anthony Harkins and Dr. Meredith McCarroll, the editors of the collection Appalachian Reckoning, A Region Responds to Hillbilly Elegy. Tony Harkins is a professor of history at Western Kentucky University in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and a scholar of U.S. popular culture history, particularly representations of rural America. He is the author of Hillbilly, A Cultural History of an American Icon, and co-editor, along with Meredith McCarroll, of Appalachian Reckoning, A Region Response to the Hillbilly Elegy, which expresses the complexities and possibilities of contemporary Appalachia through scholarship, narrative essay, photography, and poetry. Meredith McCarroll was born and raised in Waynesville, North Carolina. She graduated from Appalachian State University and later earned a master's from Simmons College and a PhD from University of Tennessee. She lives now in Portland, Maine, where she writes in teacher's writing and is apparently a little cold today. It is so welcome. We're so excited to have both of you. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
We're hoping that you could just get us started by taking a few minutes to talk about the work and introduce viewers who maybe haven't had a chance to read it yet, just to what is the collection?
Sure. Well, I can start and tell a little bit of the backstory of how this came to be as well. So, as you said, I'm a cultural historian, and particularly of representations of rural and non-coastal areas. And I've looked at, and my original work was on the image of the hillbilly. Now, I am not from Appalachia, unlike Meredith, but I came to this through sort of looking at this as a national stereotype, construction of national stereotype. And when I finished that project back in early 2000s, 2002, I kind of thought, even when I was working on the dissertation towards the end, I thought, well, this image is not going to last forever. And this, it just seems like it's on its way out. And yet it's never on its way out. It's like perpetual conception. And perfect evidence of that is the book Hillbilly Elegy that J.D. Vance wrote and rose to power on, really. And that's what spawned this book initially, because I was just sort of blown away by how popular that book was, despite all of its flaws and limitations. And I thought it would be a good panel for the Appalachian Studies Conference, which both of us attend regularly, to have an opportunity to respond to it. So I put a small panel together, went to the conference. It was a huge reaction. There were well over 100 people in the audience, very intense feelings about it, mostly negative, but with acknowledgement of some of the issues that the book raises as well. So I thought that was successful. On the way home, I got a call from West Virginia Press editor driving home saying, do you want to make it into a book? And so that was that's never happened before to me. So that was exciting, and started working on that and decided, or sort of collectively, both the editor and I decided that, we didn't quite have enough for a whole book here, just a sort of analysis of reactions to Hillbilly Elegy. And we wanted to expand beyond that to think about conceptions of Appalachians, and particularly allowing Appalachians to define for themselves what their region was and what their connections was to it. And hence enter Meredith McCarroll.
So I'll run it back a little bit. So my background, my PhD is in African American literature and film, and I'd been studying I'd really been thinking about racial constructions and how power structures show up along racial lines. And after I finished my dissertation that was about African American literature and film, I started wondering how I could maybe apply some of those same frameworks to think about region. And so my first book is called Unwhite Appalachia, Race and Film, which looks at the depictions of Appalachian people and the ways that, despite the fact that all the people from Appalachia are phenotypically white, they are portrayed often using tropes that have been used for non-white caricatures in U.S. film. So that had been my work. Basically, it was thinking about representation in a different way, very adjacent to Tony's work. Tony was someone at this point that I cited a lot in my book. His book Hillbilly is really important in Appalachian studies, and he was just like this, to me, famous guy that I cited, and I knew the publication. I had his publication information memorized so I could cite it. And I had published an essay called On and Own Appalachian Accent and Academic Power that came out in Southern Cultures out of the University of North Carolina. And the same editor that approached Tony approached me from West Virginia University Press and said, "Hey, would you like to write a memoir based on this essay you wrote?" And I said, "I don't think it's a memoir, but my story of like trying to hide my accent is common to lots and lots of people. Lots of people have that story." And so I had done a call for papers of people just telling their own. It started out thinking about academia, but then we broadened it. And so I really just kind of wanted to create a collection where people were telling their own Appalachian narratives. And what happened was I had these great stories, but I thought, I don't know. I mean, I had this great collection of personal narratives, but I wasn't sure what held them together. And because we happened to be working with the same really great editor, Andrew Brzezinski, is that how you say his last name? Is that right? He had, I went to Andrew and said, "I don't know, I just feel like it's missing something." And he and Tony had been having a conversation about that project. And so Andrew said, "Let me set up a phone call. And what do you think about talking with Anthony Harkins?" And I was like, "Anthony Harkins." But we got on the phone and we had a conversation, and Andrew just said, "I think that these books maybe need to belong together." And so the product that we ended up creating is this collection of the subtitle is Appalachian Reckoning, a region responds to Hillbilly Elegy. And the book is set up in different sections. The first half of the book is really responding and speaking back to Hillbilly Elegy, which came out in 2016 and did get so much attention. And we can talk more about all of that, but it got a lot of attention. And there were so many responses from within the region that Tony was sort of tapping into and creating a space to funnel those productively. At the same time, we thought it was worth not just speaking back against or speaking to Hillbilly Elegy, but moving beyond it. And one of the big ideas for our project was that Appalachia is this 14-state region. It spans from Alabama to New York. It's ridiculous to think that anyone could speak for that region. And yet that's what J.D. Vance was doing at that time. And so we thought we just need to have a lot of other voices, a lot of other people telling their stories that aren't necessarily disagreeing with Vance, but just sharing different stories. And that creates a chorus of voices. And so I feel like that's how I think of our collection, for sure.
Awesome. Thank you. I mean, and this is one of the things that I loved about reading it. And there are so many voices, and I think highlighting, and one of the things, there's a theme through all of our questions. We have a shared document and we all put in our questions, and when I read everyone else, like I can see we have this shared theme about this essential. I mean, this is talked about, one of the essays talks about essentializing and what happens and what are the problems with essentializing. So I'm actually going to ask you to talk about that again for viewers who don't know what I'm talking about. But I do want to just take the moment and say I so appreciated that work for pushing back against that and acknowledging it and kind of allowing people to see how that's happening. And of course, we know that it continues to happen, probably even worse now than even then, and why it needs to be addressed. But can you talk a little bit about essentializing and what that word means and why it's so important to push back against it?
Yeah. Tony, do you want to take that? Because I feel like that's a lot of,
Sure.
I mean, we can
both cover it.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly for the people of this region, that's been its history almost from its beginning points, is otherizing, and as you say, centralizing. In other words, framing it all as a single story, as a single experience, and almost always from a white male working class perspective, which is legitimate to many people in the region, but certainly not all. I mean, it's always been a region of diversity, racial diversity, obviously gender diversity, class diversity. The coal mines brought in people from everywhere, and from Eastern Europe, from the South, African Americans from the South, people from obviously the rural areas around the area. And so they were very diverse spaces. And most of that gets erased in the story, in the telling of Appalachia. Places that have a great deal of poverty also have wealthy people who are taking advantage of that. And that part is erased. And then there's some debate about, J.D. Vance's story is largely about his growing up in Ohio, in a county which is not part of Appalachia, but right on the verge of it, although he had family in Kentucky. And there is some discussion and debate about where does Appalachia lie, and do people who have left Appalachia, are they also part of the Appalachian story? And I feel they are. And, this idea of this book by Maxwell Fraser called Hillbilly Highways, last couple of years. And he talks about, and he's not the inventor of this term, but he talks about the idea of trans-Appalachia, as far as where people came from and where they went and how they come back and forth, which is a very common experience for people who've left the region. So the area is much more complex than a single story. And the other concern about J. Vance's work, and many of the essays in Appalachian Reckoning reference this, is the way he conflates his own story and a larger story. I mean, the subtitle is a memoir of a family and a culture in crisis. And one of our contributors, was sort of apoplectic about that, really. And he said, how can you have a memoir of a culture, and the idea that he kind of adopts or co-opts the larger Appalachian experience in his own is also part of that essentializing idea that everyone is the same, that there is a single way to imagine these people, and that they are erased or removed in many ways from the larger socioeconomic, cultural transitions of American history, which have so shaped the region. The region is both in some ways separate from, but also completely intertwined with the larger American story. And in some ways, he eliminates that and simply talks about his own family and their struggles. And that's legitimate. Memoirs are a totally legitimate form of discussion. But what's less legitimate is to sort of fuse it with the entire society of that area.
Yeah, I'll add a couple of things. One, I think it's really important to think about, we all know how essentializing happens. Like we essentialize, like the essentialist way of thinking about gender is the idea that, I don't know, just like whatever stereotypes you may resist and whatever your gender identity is. I think most people are like, I don't like shopping. I don't like whatever it is, right? It's the idea that like, because I'm a woman, I like whatever. It's ridiculous. And we understand that. I think most of us understand that around gender and maybe a little bit more. But what's important to me to think about is the work that essentializing does. Because my background is in African American literature, I have seen that play out very much in African American culture, that there was a very clear purpose for saying that a diverse, huge group of people had these essential characteristics because it was a way of justifying their abuse. The same thing happens to a different degree. It's the same idea that is playing out in Appalachia, that as Tony talks about in Hillbilly, some of the reasons that we need to think of people as hillbillies, as our contemporary ancestors, yesterday's people. These are terms that scholars have used to talk about, or not necessarily scholars, but people came in and used those terms to talk about people in Appalachia because it made it more okay to extract their resources, to flood their lands for a TVA dam, and move them and their cemeteries off a certain spot. It justified, the whole way that mineral rights were an abuse of people's, just an abuse of people and the land that they lived on, whether it's timber, coal. There has been this extractive and all of these extractive industries. And in order to justify doing that to people who are tied to a place, it helps to see them all as backwards, whatever, all the stereotypes that come to mind. So that sort of essentializing and imagining everyone in the same way also has that kind of dark side to it. And I wanted to, maybe we can come back and speak to this, but I guess I'll go to it while it's fresh in my mind. This idea of what does it mean to write a memoir of a culture. When we've been in conversations about this book in the past, people have pointed out, like, there is a field of study. It's called sociology, right? But that's not what he's doing. He is not a sociologist. I want to read a quote from Hillbilly Elegy that kind of shows, to me, one of the things that made so many people from this diverse region feel irritated at J.D. Vance. So in the opening of his book, he is saying, I experienced this, my mom was doing this. And then he shifts pretty subtly and starts saying we. And that shift from I to we is what made a lot of people upset. And let me just read this excerpt of what he is saying about not just his family, not just Middletown, Ohio, but what he is saying about Appalachia, about hillbillies. He writes, we choose not to work when we should be looking for jobs. Sometimes we'll get a job, but it won't last. We'll get fired for tardiness, or for stealing merchandise and selling it on eBay, or for having a customer complain about the smell of alcohol on our breath, or for taking 5 30-minute restroom breaks per shift. We talk about the value of hard work, but tell ourselves that the reason we're not working is some perceived unfairness. Obama shut down the coal mines, or all the jobs went to the Chinese. These are the lies we tell ourselves to solve the cognitive dissonance, the broken connection between the world we see and the values we preach. So that's just an example of that overreaching, essentializing, and that understandably made a lot of people upset within the region.
I'm going to just ask if you could, for those of people who are watching now or maybe later, if you could just talk a little bit about the boundaries, the regional, like you talk about multiple states, and when people think about, at least when I thought about Appalachia when I was a child, I had no comprehension beyond the western part of Pennsylvania, but in fact, we're talking about a much larger region. If you could just talk about it and why it's contested, why it's so large, why some people want to make it smaller or only talk about certain people.
Yeah, that's a big, messy question that I don't know that we'll be able to completely discuss. But the Appalachian Mountain Range is the main marker that you can point to. But there's a map that you can pull up that what this map shows 5 different boundaries or borders of Appalachia. So the first one, and this land had been mapped and categorized for as long as people like William Bartram in the 1700s came through and, was talking about what was going on here. It's not like these maps just started in 1961, but I appreciate this map because it shows the really unclear boundaries that are Appalachia. The broadest boundary that you see here with this yellow line is the Appalachian Regional Commission's second mapping in 1967. It's the most expansive. And part of that, and Tony, you jump in and you can share more specifics, but the difference in these maps has to do with, I guess the reason that I like to show this map is that it shows you a couple of things. One, when you pick out these states and you start to see like, oh, would I ever say that Alabama and New York have much in common? Like those places are really far away, and yet they belong to this same region by some mappings. That's part of it, is just to see what a big area we're talking about. The other thing is just to show how contested it is and to show that regions are not, they're not fixed. They are changing here, like the USDA map and the Southern Appalachian Regional map by the Ford Foundation. Like these maps are created differently for different purposes. And if you look at certain counties that are counted one time and not counted another time, that reflects individuals in those counties who are elected representatives advocating to either count as Appalachian so that they get certain funding from Appalachian Regional Commission, or to not count as Appalachian because they don't want to be identified as Appalachian. So when you look closely at these maps, I think that there are a lot of stories to be told along some of these borders. Tony, what else would you add about defining?
Well, what I'd add is that our book is called Appalachian Reckoning, but J.D. Vance's book is called Hillbilly Elegy. It's not called Appalachian Elegy. And in many ways, it's divorced from a sort of careful consideration of actual space, and it's more of an imagined space that Hillbilly has always occupied.
Yeah.
So earlier, Audrey was talking about Arkansas, which is not part of Appalachia, but very much the Ozarks are part of the notion of hillbilly identity, hillbilly culture. And hillbilly is a very, very complex notion, as all these terms are, that some people embrace them and accept them. Some people reject them. It really matters who is saying it to whom, right? I mean, if you're within a community and you're calling somebody a hillbilly, that and the other person shares that sentiment and that sense of community and cultural upbringing, that's one thing. If people outside of a region who don't really know anything about it use that term, that's very different. If someone who's sort of partly outside it, right? And also, why are you calling it hillbilly? Are you saying it as a term of friendship? Or are you saying it as a term of derogatoriness and as Meredith talks about, power dynamics, right? And so I think Appalachia and Appalachia versus Appalachia is also interesting. There's a lot of people in the southern part of Appalachia who embrace that pronunciation fully and basically see it as a marker of identity. But people in the northern part in Pennsylvania call it Appalachia. I can almost not say it anymore, Appalachia, but are also part of it in a sense. There's a wonderful book by Matthew Ferrance called Appalachian North, or Appalachian North, which talks about his growing up in Western Pennsylvania and how he comes to identify himself as part of this region, but also not part of it. And he says, how can you be part of a region that you don't identify yourself with? And so these terms, I think, are very vexed. And much of the problem with the way it's used in Hillbilly Elegy is they're not complex, they're not complicated at all, and it becomes this very easy throwaway term to dismiss or celebrate millions of people all as the same thing, when in fact they're quite distinct.
Yeah, so I think you can probably remove that map now, and just the point, I think, of seeing that map in this conversation is I think, what Tony pointed to, this imaginary space that that Hillbilly refers to and that JD Vance is referring to. I think that we've had a lot of conversations with people about who counts as an insider and an outsider. And to me, those conversations can be real distractions. I think that I can't remember where we were, but somewhere at a book event, there are t-shirts that say that talk about Appalachia. And there is this sense that if you say Appalachia, that you're somehow less Appalachian. I mean, it's to me, it's really silly, and it's kind of a distraction. It's this gatekeeping. And the novelist David Joy, who's a friend of mine, said, I don't care if you say Appalachia or Appalachia. I don't care how you say it. I care what you say about it. And so it's this idea of to me, and I think in our book project, we are not concerned. We don't have that map in our book because the boundaries are not really the point. The point is that when we're talking about the way that a region has been stereotyped to the extent that people who realize, oh, I'm mountain, I'm from Appalachia, does that mean I'm like the Beverly Hillbillies? I mean, it's the way that racial stereotyping works. It's the way that a lot of stereotyping works, that you start to if you don't see yourself reflected in complex ways, that you start to question who you are. That's more of what we're interested in, is the ways that someone stepping up and saying, I'll tell you what this region is. This is people who are drunk at work and are lazy. There's damage. There's real damage that is done there. It shows up in policy. It shows up in self-perception. It's like it runs the gamut. And so by speaking, by filling that void that is left when he's the only voice speaking, just with several other voices, it was important to us to not have people from all the same place, to not we didn't care if people were Appalachian. If they had an Appalachian perspective to share, we were really excited to read it. And so we have 41 contributors. We made a map at some point of all of the states that people are from. And it's across the globe where people are currently living, and not across the globe, sorry, across the country. And that matters because this identity, this Appalachian identity, is not confined by, oh, but you're in a county that's not an ARC county, so you don't get to have a perspective. You don't get to be impacted by being perceived as Appalachian or thinking of yourself as Appalachian.
I did want to ask about identity because Meredith, in your piece On and Own,
Mm-hmm.
You talk about how you left Appalachia for your education, and then you hid your accent. You had to hide certain things about your identity, and then you would go back and you would be teased for having the Boston accent.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about sort of, I don't know, the need to have to do that, to have to hide that part of yourself, and then to come back and have to fight for, or fight against the notion that maybe you're no longer Appalachian enough?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the first part of what you're talking about, leaving the region and feeling like I had to hide my accent, I think lots of people have had to do that. And if you are from a place that has a negative stereotype, or if you have an accent that is associated with a negative stereotype, then I think a lot of people are familiar with that. So it could be a Southern accent that you're explicitly told, if you want to, stand in front of a classroom and teach, you cannot say those words in that way. You have to speak in this different tone. I mean, generations of people have been told that. Black vernacular, there's lots of complexities there. So I think that this is a story that is not just Appalachian, but I think that it ties to what we were just talking about, that when the public perception is Appalachia is a scary place where people are backwards and they're lawless, then if I accidentally signal that I'm Appalachian, then those stereotypes get placed on me. And that is what happened. I remember when I moved to Boston, and I am from a gorgeous, amazing place. I'm from Western North Carolina, near Asheville. I'm so proud of where I'm from. I have no complexity. Okay, no, I guess everybody has some complex feelings about where they're from, but I'm very proud of where I'm from. It matters a lot to me. And so when I moved to Boston, and I talked really proudly about Appalachian State University, where I went to college, and about, because Boone's like such a cool town. Anybody who's been there would be like, that's a great place. But if you've never been there, and your sense of a place, when you hear Appalachian State University and you don't picture a really funky mountain town with lots of hippies, then you picture Deliverance, right? Because that's how stereotypes work. And so I literally was in Boston, and somehow it came up that maybe I just said that where I went to college, and someone did the banjo lick from Deliverance. I was like, what is happening right now? Like, that's a horror film. It's not a documentary. Like, you're associating me with like these monstrous, like, what is happening? But that was their only association with Appalachia. And so, yeah, it wasn't very conscious, but I was like, well, I'm tucking that away because I don't want people to think that I am that, obviously, but also that I'm uneducated, that like people were surprised to, at some point I was talking about where I grew up, and they were surprised about, they just had sort of ridiculous ideas of that I must be from a really rural place where, I mean, I had people say like, oh, you guys wore shoes to school. It's like, give me a break, like try harder at least. But those things happened over and over and over when I was working in Boston at the Boston Symphony, and among this class of people that kind of intimidated me. And so I just did the thing that people do, and I just kind of pushed that down and tried to fit in. And because I didn't want to be, I wasn't going to, at that point in my life, I wasn't going to explain, well, actually, that's not at all what Asheville, North Carolina is like. So yeah, over time, as I got more education, I changed the way I spoke. And then, yeah, the second half of your question, I'll make shorter. But yeah, then returning to the region in my scholarship, and spending a lot of time among really supported, like this, it's a very supportive and inclusive group of scholars and writers within Appalachian studies, but feeling a loss of like a little bit of my accent has changed, and it's hard for me to get back to it. And I think that's a loss for anyone's accent. I think the accents are amazing, and such a neat way of like showing one of the layers of who we are. And for that to be lost, it's just a loss. And so I regret that, but hopefully I've still got a little bit of it.
I'm so glad we're talking about this, because this is one of the things that I run into a lot in America. I'm not an American-born person, and I often run into people who are like, class doesn't exist in America. And I'm like, A, you've never been poor, and B, you've never had anything other than a not flat, like that flat American accent. Because let me tell you, if you have ever been poor, or you have an accent, especially as a white person, and I'm going to say especially as a white person, because I think there are a lot, I'm just going to name it, I think there are a lot of white liberal people who would never make fun of a Ghanaiese accent or an accent from, El Salvador, who have no problem making fun of white people's accents. I'm saying that as somebody who has an accent that gets mocked by those same people that I'm talking about, and they feel very comfortable. And so I've experienced it. And I know that's what you're talking about, this we need to lose these markers of class. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things I really appreciated about this book was the fact that it addresses, over and over again, it addresses class in America. And so thank you for that, because I said I'm assuming in your academic worlds, maybe in academic worlds it's a little bit different, but do you run up against people who are still maintaining this like class is not real in America? And like, how do you, we have this book, but how do we, and I'm thinking of this for our viewers, like how can we come to accept or recognize the ways in which we ourselves, and I'm talking to my nice social justice friends who have no problem mocking white people's accents. Okay, like how can we see this in ourselves and try to catch these class things that are maybe invisible that we carry with us?
Well, it's a really complicated question. I think it kind of depends what people mean by there's no class in America. And I think in some ways what it often gets framed as is there's no permanent class. So if you are poor, you either should rise above it on your own merits, right? Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps.
Like J.D. Vance.
Yeah. And that's the J.D. Vance story. It's very much the Horatio Alger, updating Horatio Alger, right? Without Horatio Alger's sort of intervention of a middle-class person to sort of show him the way. One of the other things about J.D. Vance's approach is he erases all the things that also benefited him, often having to do with the state, whether it's education or the military or other things, and it just becomes a sort of individual story. But if I think people recognize there are poor people, but the question is, why are they poor? And if they remain poor, then that must be some flaw of theirs. That's the sort of what Meredith quoted there about drunk at work and lazy and all of that. And that applies to everybody, right, in that condition. And we don't want to ever accept the fact that there are systematic institutional reasons for people to be unable to move out of poverty. Or sometimes it's a choice, it's a legitimate choice not to be poor, but to value family and community and place over advancement at all costs. And I think, a middle-class perspective is often one where those things always need to be secondary to your personal advancement. And so you move a lot and, you don't have this sort of sense that you've always been from one place. There's exceptions, of course. But somehow it becomes a sort of personal failure to be in the condition you're in, or even to have the accent you do, right? So if you maintain that accent, it must be because you're not getting with the program as far as how you're supposed to be moving up in the world. Mm-hmm. And what you're supposed to be willing to sacrifice to do so, or not seen as a sacrifice in some ways, right? Get rid of in order to do so. But there's also, I think, conversely, when I hear Meredith or when I hear Silas House or when I hear other people, it's just so incredible to hear those accents and to know how they are rooted in place and space and community, and a refusal to sort of give those things up in order to simply advance yourself. And so, it's a mix of things. I think there can be now that can also become a patronizing thing where you're like, oh, isn't that cute? Those accents that they have, and this is sweet. So I do think, though, your point, Kyla, about erasure of yourself as a kind of price of the ticket for mobility is something which some people just, many people in Appalachia, I think that's too high a price to pay, right? And so, and then other people, have to survive, and they do what they have to do to survive. But I think it's complicated. I mean, all these things I think are much more nuanced than we often see at the front end. I also think what Carla says about perfectly happy to mock a white, quote unquote, white accent versus a non-white accent is also how we have shaped notions of what is discriminatory and what is not along racial lines in a way that erases all the ways that class also shapes people's identities and experiences and possibilities.
I was just thinking too about, for me, if I'm thinking in a sociological way, in America, I am always thinking about race because race and class are so tied because of our history. And I'm thinking about this moment in 1964 when the Appalachian Regional Commission was about to be formed as the War on Poverty, what was known as the War on Poverty, was launched. So Johnson was president, and they were trying to figure out so we want to have support for this huge system that is going to provide, I mean, it's everything from like Head Start to, Tony, do you know off the top of your head, like some of the programs? And it's all of these, so many programs that were initiated through the War on Poverty that affect people all across the country, poor people across the country. And as they were trying to figure out, so it's 1964, they're trying to figure out where do we go to launch this war. And they went to Letcher, Kentucky, to a really poor, really white place, because the white face of poverty in our country in 1964 evoked empathy, whereas going to Detroit in that moment would not evoke the same sort of empathy. And so there's something complicated. I don't have like a point that's very clear to make. I just want to like keep in the conversation that we have a different, I do think that there's incredible judgment in the ways that Tony was talking about, that if you're poor, it's because it's not about the systems that are failing you. It is about the fact that you haven't worked hard enough. And I think that there is a different way that we talk about poverty that is white than poverty that is especially Black in our country. That is that moment in 1964 when Johnson came to Letcher County. After that, documentary filmmakers, photographers, Time Magazine, John Dominice from Time Magazines, all of these photographers and filmmakers came to literally the same holler in the same county to film the same people, because they couldn't even think about like, well, what is 2 counties over? What's in another state? Where even is Appalachia? The questions that we're talking about today, they were really relying on these same ideas. And so it sort of became this, just like this really closed loop where a lot of the stereotypes that persist today coming out of liberal media from 1964, to me, are tied to the liberal media initial adoration of J.D. Vance's book, because it's easy to forget the time between 2016 and 2025. But in 2016, J.D. Vance was on NPR talking about his book as a way of explaining this strange thing that had happened with Trump being elected, which J.D. Vance found to be horrifying. And then you fast forward and liberal media is whatever that means. But, NPR is not interviewing J.D. Vance. They're interviewing us to talk about how J.D. Vance got it wrong. And it's when we limit the stories that we tell, there's real danger there.
Yeah, I'm going to give it back to Audrey and Tiana, but this is another thing that I wanted to talk about, which I specifically, there's different things in there, but one of the things I really loved, and did I write the page number down? Yes, I did, 322. That's not a test. I'm going to read it out loud. Kevin Wilson's holler, and this is a multi-page piece, but I thought I would just read the very beginning for viewers. I'll just be quick and hopefully do it some justice. Never mind my skin. I sound sown to the cops, white to one side of my family, Californian to Southerners, Southern to Californians, militant to the creative agency. And it goes on. But one of the things I really appreciated was, as we talk about, and you've mentioned it here, is that as we talk about, I don't know who we are, but collectively talking about Appalachia, we essentialize, as we've talked about, Appalachian folks, and that includes having them be exclusively white and exclusively poor, and insert another, some more pejoratives. But it's not only reductive to, yes, white people who live in Appalachia, it's also completely erases entire communities and families and histories and entire peoples. We recently had Frank X. Walker, who is the author of Appalachia, for another one of his poetry collections to our Lunch and Learn, for example, as one of the many, many vibrant people who are in Appalachia. And your work has been about, Meredith, you talk a lot about representation. So I just wanted to kind of highlight this part that you're bringing forward too, like that for viewers to think about the stereotypes that we carry with us that we don't even necessarily recognize we're carrying because of what you're talking about, Deliverance, Hillbilly Elegy. These images, the snapshots that we see of these regions are so limited for most people who don't live there, I think.
Yeah, and Keith, whose poem you just read, is an Appalachian poet, a part of the group that Frank X. Walker co-founded. So yeah, there's a lot of erasure that can happen.
I guess one of the things that really is interesting to me is when I read Hillbilly Elegy, I liked it until the end. I listened to it, actually. I was on my way to and from. And I actually had to pull over to the side of the road when he said something about, then that's why I'm a Republican. And I just went, what did I just listen to? And because I felt, and over time, and like it really made me think, like, why did I like this book? And this is not my politics. And I guess one of the things I was really curious about is that it really, there is some truth to what he says. And what I want to make very clear to those of you at home, this is not like a let's rip apart J.D. Vance, which I was a little surprised that it wasn't, because I kind of wanted that. Why, I'm not really sure, but it was very even keeled, and it was very, there were authors in here who really gave J.D. Vance, okay, this is your experience, but one of the negative kind of things that comes out of the whole controversy about whether it is and what it is, oh, you're being too scholarly, you're being too intellectual about it. It's really not that. And what I really loved about this book in particular is it reads just as well as Hillbilly Elegy. And I just like to talk briefly about, when you put this together, how did you want it to be read? Who did you want to read it? And why did you include all these different types of media in there?
Yeah. Well, some of that has to do with our experience in Appalachian studies, I think, which is very interdisciplinary. It's a wonderful conference. It's happened every year since, 73 or something, quite a while. And it's one of the only academic conferences I go to where you have both scholars and activists and community people who are developing projects, both economic and social. You have high school students, you have artists. So it's this very wide-ranging thing like this. And so as we were putting the book together, we thought that we wanted, and also Meredith's earlier project had a lot of poets, and even the recipe, someone sort of opining about these recipes and what they mean. And then we added photography later on because of this wonderful project looking at Appalachia. But we wanted to sort of say that, one of the ways to think about the complexity and diversity of this area is the different kinds of people that are part of it. They are artists, they are scholars, they are opinion makers, they are community organizers, and all of that is part of this story. And so we wanted to include as much of that as we could in the book.
Yeah, as we were pulling these two projects together, in some ways, I think in retrospect, it's important to see that if we had started together to make a book that was eventually going to be called a region response to Hillbilly Elegy, I don't know that we would have that Keith Wilson poem or that Kelly Norman Ellis poem that includes these antebellum recipes. Those were already invited into the project that I was working on that didn't have anything to do with J.D. Vance. And when they came together, I reached out to all of the contributors that I had been working with and said, okay, the project's shifting. Like, let's talk about that. And around that same time, as Tony mentioned, we talked to Roger May, who's a photographer who curates this project called Looking at Appalachia. So I think it's just looking at Appalachia.com, has, he just asks people from any Appalachian place to send in their photographs. So we went to Roger and said, would you be the photography editor for this project? And to me, it was such a foundational conversation because Roger is this really kind, thoughtful, intelligent artist who said, I just don't want to be a part of anything that's mean-spirited. And though Tony and I had never used that language, we were able to clearly say, oh, we don't either. That's a good guide for us. There's no part of us that wanted to try to knock down J.D. Vance. There are some individuals in the book, maybe that's what they're up to. And so some of those voices are included. But to me, it was always about, like we said at the beginning, creating a chorus of voices, because that is a more accurate representation of a complex region. And so with Roger's voice in our heads of not being a part of something that's mean-spirited, it allowed us to have real clarity about what we would say, what we wouldn't say, places we would go, places we would avoid, in terms of just not geographic places, but ways that we would have conversations and that we wouldn't. And to me, one of the best things that has happened is at the launch of the book, someone at the end said, well, you've told us a bunch of things about that Appalachia isn't. Now tell us what it is. And Tony and I were sitting there with another Appalachian poet, Crystal Good, and with Roger May, who we were just talking about. And we all just kind of looked at each other like, we can't. Who would try to say, well, I'll tell you what America is, or here's the answer of what characteristics are about Appalachia. This is Appalachia. The point of our book is that you finish it and you say, I thought I understood what Appalachia was, and now I really don't. That's great. You shouldn't be able to so easily understand it. So I think that messiness paired well with not a messiness, but a complexity of form that just having a lot of scholars didn't feel right to us.
How do you think that this collection, because you had mentioned it's been out for a while, how do you think that this collection has then kind of stirred the creative juices within your communities? What kind of projects have come out of this? Books or projects that kind of were birthed out of this that you really are really proud of because of having all these conversations?
Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I don't know of any, there's not an immediate answer. I think that I've been really proud of the conversations that we have been able to have with people that are not where we're not just offering an answer of this is what Appalachia is, but instead just keeping it messy and complicating it. I think that we offered a model of how to do ethical work. We were lucky that this book did really well in terms of lots of different markers. It won the Weatherford Award for Best Nonfiction Book in Appalachian Studies. And that means a whole lot to us. It also won the American Book Award that year. And that means that a lot of people outside of Appalachian Studies read the book. And so when it won the American Book Award and when we had a New York Times review from Dwight Billings, I hope that opened up an imaginative space for academic presses. Collections tend to not sell well. They tend to not be quite worth the investment from the press. So to get a New York Times review and to win an American Book Award was really surprising to everyone, just because that doesn't tend to happen. It had to do with not only is the book solid, lots of solid books don't get that. It also had to do with the timing and the support of West Virginia University Press. So I hope that, I don't know that I can say this is a specific project that came out, but I see a lot more collections coming out of University of Kentucky Press and some different places. I don't know. Do you have any other thoughts, Tony?
No, I do. I think, I mean, I have been struck and proud of the fact that it is so widely read. It is on a lot of lists of like best books on Appalachia, or here's what you should read instead of Hillbilly Elegy, or after you've read Hillbilly Elegy or something. And I do think it's a model of interdisciplinarity that is not just about, that's also sort of a diversity of voices, of forms, and also of approaches. You know, some are scholarly with lots of footnotes and references, and then some are personal memoir type things, and some are sort of in between. And it just, I think, is a good model of how to do that. It's personally been a great model of how to, the benefits of collective work. And, you know, I think both Meredith and I think this is one of the best experiences we've personally had, is working together as co-editors, and how much we both were different and the same, and recognized our mutual strengths and limitations, and got to travel, you know, and talk about the book in a lot of places. And yeah, it's just been a joy. And because J.D. Vance remains relevant, it remains relevant too, in a way. And that's both the kind of, you know, that's a kind of the mixed part of this. But it does, you know, it has been, I think, a great thing for me personally to realize that, and how valuable working with others is. You know, academic work is often, particularly in history, is often very individualized. And, you know, there's almost a dismissal of works that you've done with other people, in terms of like, well, who gets credit for what? And is that really as much work as writing your own thing? And it's just shown me how great an experience it can be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, this has just been a wonderful time. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but thank you so much, Meredith and Tony, for spending time with us today and for talking about this work. We love it. You brought so many important voices to light. And so for those of you watching, we hope you get a sense of the book, but also there's so many voices and stories, and it's rich and interesting. We really encourage you to read it. You can buy it right now from your favorite independent bookstore, or take it out from your local library system. If they don't have it, ask them to get it in. It really is worth just kind of diving in and getting to have these experiences. We are also so glad that you chose to tune in, whether you are watching live or watching on demand later. You are why we do what we do. And we hope that we'll see you again soon. Lunch and Learn, though, is going on hiatus for 3 weeks, but we're back on June 17th. So please set a reminder to join us again. And we invite you to join us tonight at Mixed Food Hall in Mount Rainier for our in-person Solidarity Stories book group. We are talking about Art Spiegelman's Mouse. So you can learn about this and all of our other work by visiting the Office of Human Rights webpage, which you can get to by going to civilrights.mypgc. Try that one more time. civilrights.mypgc.us. And also please take time to see all that the library has to offer by going to their webpage. They do many, many things every single day. pgcmls.info/events. Again, thank you, Tony. Thank you, Meredith. It's been wonderful. Have a great rest of your week, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.